They are called Nusich, Aguna, Agai, and many other names. Their power and majesty have been worshipped by Indians of the Columbia River Basin for centuries. But today their story is a troubled one. They are Chinook and Sockeye, Coho, Chum, and Steelhead. By 1980, they had been pushed to the brink of extinction, and they are now the focus of the most ambitious fish and wildlife restoration program ever conceived. From the time salmon are born, they are destined to travel. After migrating downstream, they fight the vast northern Pacific from 2 to 5 years, moving northward through the Gulf of Alaska and south to California in great circles that bring them back miraculously to the same Pacific Northwest rivers from which they came. Then begins their tough rush back upstream. Scientists believe that salmon retain the scent of their natal streams to guide them back up the river. When they enter the Columbia, they stop taking in food. They are desperately searching for their own birthplace, where they will spawn and die. When Lewis and Clark crossed the Continental Divide, they entered an uncharted part of their new country where few white people had traveled. For the Indians, the most precious treasures were the abundant wildlife that provided food and clothing, the forests that gave them shelter, and the lifeline for this entire ecosystem, the mighty Columbia River. Each year, the Columbia and its tributaries would come alive with salmon. For eagles and other natural predators, they meant survival. The many tribes who celebrated their return each year harvested huge baskets of the salmon to store for winter food. But still they came, leaping powerful rapids to blanket the river bottoms from spring to fall. Then, with the settlers, came a new age of progress, and times began to change. To the settlers, the salmon seemed unlimited in numbers, an annual feast that pushed up the rivers for the picking. Before long, they were an enterprise. Columbia River salmon were harvested, canned, and shipped worldwide. At one time, 39 canneries employing thousands of people flourished from the bounty of these Columbia River runs. Then more industry came, logging and farming, mining and road building, and urban development in general. In the 30s, the first big dams to span the river were built. The white man's attention was focused on development. Some, like Woody Guthrie, told the story in song.
Sam, he took the challenge in the year of 33 for the farmers and the workers and for all humanity. Now, river, you can ramble where the sun sets in the sea, but while you're rambling, river, you can do some work for me. Roll, Columbia, won't you roll, roll, roll? Roll, Columbia, won't you roll, roll, roll?
The Columbia River Basin encompasses more than 260,000 square miles, from the northern Rockies to the Pacific Ocean, reaching into portions of 7 states and 2 nations. At the peak of their abundance, salmon and steelhead runs reached into nearly all of this territory. Then, society began to harness these rivers, generating billions of watts of power to electrify a growing Northwest and irrigate millions of acres of desert to make them into croplands. In less than a century, Salmon and steelhead populations numbering 10 to 16 million each year were cut by about 85%. In some areas, salmon runs were completely eliminated. Genetic diversity among the runs was severely limited. Fishers, Indian and non-Indian alike, began to see their very means of existence disappearing. The problem is that fish and wildlife never did get along with hydroelectric dams. Dams kill fish. In low water years, experts figure that up to 95% of the young fish died in hydropower turbines and reservoirs as they migrated to the sea. Of those that survived, matured in the ocean, and returned to the river to spawn, only a portion made it past the dams. The more dams they had to pass on both their downstream and upstream journeys, the smaller were their chances of survival. The economies of small towns from the Rockies to the Pacific were being drained. The collision course between the fishery and power producers came to a head. And in 1980, Congress passed the Northwest Power Act. It charged the newly formed Pacific Northwest Electric Power and Conservation Planning Council with the creation of a 20-year electric energy plan and a regional fish and wildlife program to protect and rebuild the fish and wildlife resources harmed by hydroelectric development in the Columbia Basin. The Bonneville Power Administration, with the cooperation of the electric utilities of the region, was called upon to fund these plans to resurrect the world's largest Chinook salmon and steelhead runs. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamation, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, along with Bonneville, were told to consider the river's fish and wildlife as equal to power generation or any other river use. Saving the salmon, Congress declared, would now be considered one of the costs of pulling electricity from the Columbia. The Council acknowledged that managing the fish and wildlife program would have to come through cooperation among fish and wildlife agencies and the Indian tribes, co-managers of these resources, and those who manage the dams and market power from them. Never before had fisheries managers and hydroelectric system operators cooperated to save the fish. And no earlier effort approached the fisheries so comprehensively. The program developed by the Council from the recommendations of both the fish managers and the power managers attempts to protect the salmon from its birth through its long journey to the sea, then back up the river to its gravel birthplace. The young salmon hatch in freshwater streams from eggs laid amid the gravel. Some wait there for a year or more before catching a spring runoff to carry them along their migration route to the sea. But the Columbia's great dams block their paths. Fish ladders were built into some dams, but they only help returning adults climb upstream past the dams. It wasn't until the 1960s that scientists began to realize the most devastating impact on the salmon was the loss of juvenile fish trying to move downstream. 11 major hydroelectric facilities span the Columbia River in the United States. 7 more sit astride the Snake River. Some of them don't yet have screens and bypass channels to keep small fish safely away from turbines. Without such safeguards, about 15% of the fish are killed in the turbines at each dam. Another problem lies in changes these dams make to the Columbia and other rivers in the basin. Instead of being free-flowing streams, waters behind dams are slow-moving pools, more akin to lakes than rivers, that stall fish waiting to be carried downstream by the current. Slowing their journey also upsets the delicate timing of crucial biological changes in young salmon and steelhead, whose bodies must physiologically adapt from freshwater to saltwater as they migrate. Downstream travel from Idaho to the Pacific once took migrating fish about 2 weeks. The dams and reservoirs more than doubled that migration time. If their journeys take too long, some fish die because they lose the instinct to migrate to the sea. Others become easy pickings for predators like squawfish in the reservoirs. The council coordinated efforts of Bonneville and other federal and state agencies, Indian tribes, and dam operators to boost the number of fish that survive their encounters with hydroelectric dams. It helped design a way that the Corps of Engineers, Bonneville, and utilities can run dams in a fashion that mimics Mother Nature. Each spring, those federal agencies release a block of water that they previously would have kept stored behind upriver dams until later in the year. That release, known as the water budget, partially simulates the spring runoff of snowmelt and rushes small salmon and steelhead downstream through reservoirs between dams. At the same time, the council called on these federal agencies to improve the survival rate of fish as they pass the dams themselves. Nearly everyone agrees that the best solution is to install permanent screens at each dam. These screens guide fish away from power-generating turbines and into channels cut through the dams. Once adequate screens and bypass channels are in place at every dam, the number of fish that die at each facility will be reduced by half. These screens aren't cheap, costing tens of millions of dollars at each dam, but the alternatives are more costly. Without screens and bypass channels, fish are washed over the dam spill bays instead of being run past the turbines. Releasing water over the dams instead of running it through the turbines during a height of salmon and steelhead migrations cost the region millions of dollars in lost power sales each year. Nevertheless, studies show that more young fish survive going over the dams than through the turbines. The council, Bonneville, Fish and Wildlife agencies, Indian tribes, and utilities have negotiated an agreement that sets rates of annual water releases, known as spill levels, at 4 of the main stem federal dams. In addition, in low-flow years, millions of salmon and steelhead will be collected at upriver dams, loaded into barges and trucks, and transported downriver for release below Bonneville Dam. Most of the newer dams have fish bypass systems built in. Others have had screens and bypass channels added. 3 dams on the Columbia and Snake Rivers, Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, and the Dalles, don't have fish screens. And 5 others, Little Goose, McNary, Lower Granite, John Day, and Bonneville, need improvements. These passage improvements provide some relief for the beleaguered runs, but there are other problems. Mining, logging, cattle grazing, farming, road building, and commercial development in general have left their mark on salmon and steelhead spawning habitat. Some streams were blocked. Others were clogged with silt, smothering salmon eggs before they could hatch. Through the council's recovery plan, stream bank restoration projects are improving salmon habitat in many parts of the basin. Thousands of miles of habitat already have been restored. Irrigation has made the deserts bloom, but diversion canals and ditches can take too much water from streams, leaving valuable spawning grounds high and dry. Furthermore, many of these diversions also lack the means to help fish pass them safely. Washington's Yakima Basin is a prime example of both irrigation's productivity and its cost to the fishery. Annual fish runs in the Yakima Basin once numbered more than 500,000 salmon and steelhead. With irrigation development and losses to hydropower dams on the Columbia, these runs had dropped in the 1970s to just 1,000. With funds from the Bonneville Power Administration, Washington State, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and in cooperation with the Yakima Indian Nation and the basin's irrigators, fish passage at the dams is being improved. More than 20 fish ladders, screens, and bypass channels have already been installed, and some runs in recent years have been up. Throughout the Columbia system, the Council is working with fishery agencies and Indian tribes to learn more about the migration of young salmon and steelhead. Young fish, called smolts, are tagged at hatcheries, and a fin is clipped so that they can be identified when they return as adults. Brands on others will tell biologists further downstream where the fish began their migration and how they're faring. The Council has even developed a computer model to trace the salmon along its route from gravel to the sea and back to gravel. This model can test various actions fish managers propose to help save the runs. Once the young fish get to the sea, the journey is no less hazardous. Destined to travel the Pacific sometimes as long as 5 years, they will find ocean predators even more plentiful, and man is chief among them. The demand on this resource is incredible, and the Council is trying to make sure that its efforts to rebuild river runs aren't canceled out by over-harvesting. In 1985, Northwesterners from Oregon north to Alaska and east into Idaho negotiated a treaty that had been on the table for more than 20 years. The U.S. and Canada Pacific Salmon Interception Treaty called for reduced harvests of diminished stocks until rebuilding programs like the Council's could begin to have an effect. But various stocks from various rivers and tributaries, plus hatchery stocks, all swim and get caught together in the sea. To preserve the remnants of damaged runs, limits must be set on the taking of all salmon in the waters containing them. This way, managers make sure that enough mating pairs return to their natal streams to spawn. When instinct tells them the time is right, mature fish return, as they have for centuries, to coastal rivers from Alaska to California in search of their ancestral streams. Once again, their way is blocked by dams. Fish ladders give them a chance to conquer some of these impassable walls, but for all their power and determination, some salmon and steelhead cannot find the entrance to these ladders. Studies to improve the ladders are an ongoing part of the Council's program. Hundreds more hydropower projects have been proposed for streams and tributaries basin-wide. The cumulative impacts on fish and wildlife habitat could be severe. In 1988, the Council coordinated the efforts of the 4 Northwest states to protect stream reaches where fish or wildlife would be irreparably harmed if new dams are built. They studied thousands of stream miles. When all the data was in, a lengthy dialogue was encouraged to debate the pros and cons of blocking dam construction on certain streams. The Council decided to designate more than 44,000 miles of stream reaches as protected areas because of their value to salmon and steelhead. Salmon are famed for their acute navigational instincts. Once they return to fresh water, they stop eating, living off their body reserves, their entire energy devoted to the battle upstream. As they return, society again takes a hand to help restore the depleted runs. Hatchery crews, such as this one on the South Fork of Idaho's Salmon River, 750 miles from the ocean, trap some of the returning salmon each summer to retrieve their valuable eggs. Some fish are passed by the hatchery to spawn naturally, but those trapped are kept in holding tanks until they're ready. To ensure future salmon runs, the precious eggs are gathered from females and fertilized. The young are reared in the hatchery for a full year before being released. Some of the smolts are released into streams adjacent to the hatchery, but others are taken to streams where runs are dangerously depleted or extinct, giving more salmon the chance to make the journey of their ancestors. About 70% of Columbia River salmon and steelhead are bred in hatcheries. Many biologists consider this a precarious dependency. In some cases, diseases in hatcheries have killed nearly all the fish reared there. So improving hatchery facilities and procedures is an important step. Furthermore, there is concern that the genetic diversity and inherent strength of native salmon populations may be jeopardized if the Council's program does not balance hatchery production with the preservation of wild runs of these fish. To this end, the Council has asked fisheries managers and other interested people to carefully study important tributaries of the Columbia and come up with plans for increasing the runs these streams can sustain over time. When the wild salmon return to their home streams to spawn naturally, they must wait for nature to take its course. When the time is right, the females instinctively begin digging a nest in the graveled river bottom to house the nearly 3,000 eggs they each carry. The males choose one of these nests, called redds, as their territory and will attack any intruders. When the female has completed her nest, she moves upstream and releases her eggs, allowing the gentle current to carry them to their resting place in the gravel. Sensing that his time has come, the male passes over the redd and fertilizes the eggs. Their life cycle at an end, nature reclaims their aging bodies. For them, the journey is over, but for the next generation, the fight for survival is just beginning. Salmon and steelhead are not the only creatures affected by our harnessing of rivers and streams, especially in the upper reaches of the Columbia River Basin, where dams completely cut off access beyond. The resident fish, such as brown and rainbow trout, here face many of the same problems that migratory salmon and steelhead do in the lower Columbia and Snake Rivers as a result of hydro development throughout the basin. 2 new hatcheries have been built through the Council's recovery program to replenish these upriver lakes and streams with fish that do not need to migrate to the sea. The Council also works with state and federal bodies to explore innovative ways to repair or reclaim wildlife habitats and populations that have been hurt by hydroelectric dams in the region. In 1989, the Council helped set up a trust fund to pay for efforts to redress the damage caused by Hungry Horse and Libby dams in Montana, and is working with relevant utility and wildlife interests on wildlife mitigation proposals for other dams in Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. The placement of nesting boxes in Canada goose habitat in many parts of the basin protects nests from fluctuating water levels caused by hydropower projects. Habitat has also been provided and is being maintained for bighorn sheep. The sheep are fitted with radio devices so they can be tracked and their survival monitored. These programs and others like them are all part of the Council's plan to preserve the wildlife heritage that has always been a part of the Northwest. The Council is dedicated to carrying out its program to keep salmon and steelhead runs a reality far into our future. Protection of the pristine fish and wildlife habitat that remains must continue if these plans are to be realized. The Council follows a process called adaptive management. Simply put, it means learning by doing, perhaps modifying what you do as you learn more. Measures to protect and improve the basin's fish and wildlife populations are designed as experiments to increase knowledge about the fish while taking action to protect them. That ongoing management will take unprecedented cooperation among parties who were historical adversaries: dam operators and fisheries managers, anglers and Indian fishers. But all these players have demonstrated a willingness to play on the same team, making the preservation of the Northwest's fish and wildlife their collective priority. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been put to work on that cause. Much more will be spent in coming years. This is not a short-term project. Success here can only be measured in generations, multiplying generations. The Council's plan encompasses thousands of miles and as many lives. For the fish, it may be the last chance. Their indomitable spirit and determination are still being tested by humans and by nature. But despite all the odds, the salmon have survived.
It's always been amazing that we get any fish back at all, really. Kind of something special when you get some adults back that you've actually helped raise.
I think it would be a real crime if we permitted this resource to be lost in the Northwest. To see fish that'll still migrate 900 miles up the Columbia, up the Snake, into some of those tributaries is a sight that you never forget.
It's something that my grandchildren will see, hopefully, someday, the salmon in the river.
The water resource is not only going to be used for a single entity, for irrigated agriculture, that though agriculture has probably taken the primary use of the water for the last 100 years, that now there is a time and a need to share that water so we can have a balance between the fisheries resource and the agricultural resource.
The important thing I think that people need to realize is not a matter of or a case of an either-or situation. If we do things properly and plan properly for true multi-resource management, we can have both a very viable irrigation agriculture and have substantially improved fish runs.
I'd like to come out here with my own kids, you know, show them the salmon up here on our own property. I remember when I was a real little kid, I'd see the sheep herders out there and they'd have them. You know, that's a long time ago, 15 years ago or more. I'd like to see them up here.
They must, they can return if the people of the Northwest continue to participate in this uncommon collaboration. The journey of the salmon is a journey we must all share to save this heritage that is so valuable to us all.